The title of my dissertation is Patrons, Pupils, and Partners, How Women Adapted Ignatian Spirituality and Pedagogy. Although the dissertation encompasses many centuries of women and Jesuits and women that were influenced by St. Ignatius, I began with the women who were in Ignatius's circle, women that he first came in contact with. For example, the story is well known, his story is well known, how he was wounded in battle and how he recuperated at his castle home in Loyola, and that he was only given 2 books to read, the lives of the saints and the life of Christ. But what is not mentioned often enough is the fact that his sister-in-law, his older brother Martin's wife, Magdalena Loyola, actually was the mistress of the household, and she was very instrumental in giving those books to him. So thereby a woman gave him the books which eventually led to his own awakening, so to speak. And then as he truly abandoned the life of the knight and being a knight, and dedicated his life not to a temporal God but to an eternal one, he left the altar of the Black Virgin at Montserrat and moved on to the town of Manresa. The very first woman he met in Manresa was a woman by the name of Inez Pascual. Inez really took him in, gave him shelter, gave him food, and she began to have these conversations with him and with her own little circle of female friends. And his name at this point, Ignatius's name at this point, was still Inigo. That was his baptismal name. He did not become Ignatius until later on when he went to the University of Paris. And Inez and her his fan club, I should say, her little group of friends, called themselves the Inigas. And he began to share his feelings of spirituality, his own metamorphosis that he was going through, his way of discerning good from evil, and sharing these with these women. And Inez was one of the first that he shared them with. And Inez is the first one that he wrote a letter to as he was on his journey then to the university. Afterwards, Inez was remembered very, very fondly by Ignatius. There were other women too. Inez had other friends. One was named Isabel Rosa. Isabel was a little bit wealthier than Inez, and she was very much enthralled with St. Ignatius and his teachings, his spiritual teachings. And she herself later on followed him to Rome with 2 of her female companions, Francesca Acrilis and Isabel de la Hosa. And the 3 of them followed Ignatius to Rome in the hopes of actually being a Jesuit. I think what is so prominent at this point in his life was that he was moving on his own conversion, but these women were also moving to their conversion. He was finding a new life for himself, and I think little did he realize that at that time the women were also feeling a spiritual freedom because of his influence on them. It was sad because women at that time, because of societal norms, being a largely patriarchal society, they really couldn't experience freedom in many, many respects because of political and societal standards. And yet they found this freedom in the sharing of Ignatian spirituality. I found out about the women in Ignatius's life through a reading of a compilation of letters that was written by Hugo Rahner of the Society of Jesus, a brother to Karl Rahner, also of the Society of Jesus. And Hugo Rahner, in his seminal work that was about 50 years or so now ago in the making, compiled all of the letters that Ignatius wrote to women, and where extant the letters that women wrote back to him. These are letters that are to the women of the royal court, royal circle that Ignatius knew as a young man. There are also letters to mothers of Jesuits. There are letters to the women such as Inez and Isabel and the other patrons such as Maria Frassoni del Gesso. These are women that helped to not only further his own personal education, but women who furthered the actual education of the society by becoming college foundresses and helping out the order in that respect. But it's a wonderful group of letters, and it's introduced by Father Rahner, and it just goes through many, many stages in Ignatius's own conversion. The first letter, as I mentioned, was to Inez, thanking her and letting her know how he was doing as he reached Paris to begin his own studies as an adult learner. Then there are letters, to back and forth to Isabel. Those are quite comical because they talk about Isabel just dropping everything to follow him to Rome because she actually believed she would become a Jesuit. There are letters that refer to Princess Juana of Spain, who actually became the only female Jesuit to her dying day, which is a story within itself. And again, these letters reveal his own inner thoughts. One letter in particular, which many believe is the standard by which the spiritual exercises can be judged in a letter, and that is the letter to Teresa Regidella of the convent of Santa Clara in Barcelona, Spain. Teresa heard of Ignatius, I want to say, through the same Isabel Roser Inez Pascual circle, and she begged Ignatius up until her death to take on her convent and the reform of her convent. And the letter that Ignatius wrote to Teresa, as I said, many think is the seminal piece for his own spirituality coming forth in a letter. And he talks to her about the spiritual exercises and how important they are, and the various stages of good and evil and discernment of good and evil. And so that particular source, Rahner's letters, were very, very important. Of course, I also used as a source the spiritual exercises. Having made the spiritual exercises myself, that really gave me an insight as to not just reading the exercises in a book form, but actually experiencing them. And then, of course, I also looked at the Ratio Studiorum, which is the Ignatian treatise on pedagogy. And I compare that ratio to plans of studies of women foundresses in centuries past Ignatius as they formed schools for young women in the model of the Ignatian schools for young boys. And I also researched some of the letters of these women foundresses as well. I think what we need to remember about Ignatius is that he was very, very human. Indeed, very, very human. He was bound by the societal norm, but yet I think there was a great conflict inside of him to include women in his ministry. And a prime example of that, to me, was when he formed, very instrumental in forming the Compagnia della Grazia in Rome and the surrounding area. The Compagnia della Grazia was comprised of laymen and laywomen, as well as Jesuits, and they ministered to the homeless women, the prostitutes, and the offspring of homeless women and prostitutes, literally taking them off the streets of Rome and putting them in the Casa de Santa Marta, the House of St. Martha. And this Compagnia was really the really early stages, if you will, of social work agencies today. And I feel that Ignatius was really thinking out of the box here and really, really projecting ahead by combining the laity and the Jesuits combining together to do good for the society. So that's a special moment for me because I can really see that transcending time. And what do I mean by that? I mean that many questions have come up about, with Jesuits dwindling numbers today, what is the role of the laity in the Society of Jesus, and what will become as their numbers, if their numbers continue to dwindle, what will be the role of women? And of course there is the argument that women should be ordained priests, and not taking one side or the other in that particular question. I think that a revisiting of the whole premise of the Compagnia della Grazia just might well be something that the Jesuits might need to look at in the future. What can women do today? in Jesuit institutions. I think women today in Jesuit institutions, and I'm not saying this is all women, but for those women who say, oh, the Jesuits, you know, they still, you have to go in their doorway, so to speak. I think that that is not necessarily true. I think that the women need to realize that they can be linked with these women in Ignatius's past. I think the linchpin, if you will, or the connecting thread, if you will, through all of these women, from Inez to Isabel, to Teresa, to Princess Juana, to the women foundresses, to the women of today, the connecting thread is the spirituality of the Society of Jesus. And I think the women today need to realize that. I think they need to learn more. I think they should hear more of the stories of these women, the vignettes, if you will, of these women. We're not talking about rehearsing the past. We're talking about acknowledging it, knowing that, you know, this did happen, you know, 300, 400, 500 years ago, but that there is certainly plenty of room for the Jesuits to have more conversations with women today and for women to have conversations with them, as long as they realize that the spirituality, this freedom that one gets from the exercises and from the pedagogy of St. Ignatius and the Jesuits, as long as that can somehow be, your heart, so to speak, can be open to that, I think that's the way of the future. I have an interesting story I'd like to tell. I was interviewing a Jesuit, and solely with the intent of what can he tell me about this St. Ignatius that I can use for my dissertation. And he said, you know, you really should, you know, look at the exercises. And I have to confess, I had not read them, I had not experienced them. And so one conversation led to another, and I was able to go through the spiritual exercises. And it took, I want to say, probably close to a year, but about 9 months doing, you know, readings and then being mentored and guided by my Jesuit mentor. And one of the first things that I noticed was that this was a soldier's writing of exercises. Ignatius was a soldier, very, very masculine terms. And when I mentioned this to a couple of my female colleagues, one mentioned that she had looked at the exercises, and but that's not for women, that's only for men, and how could I even begin to understand that? And I think one of the greatest premises of anything Ignatian is the beauty of seeing God in all things and of having an imagination. And I love to imagine. I'm a historian first and foremost, and I love to put myself back in history and relive, you know, times in history. I imagine that I'm there with senses, you know, feelings and tasting and seeing, hearing. And so for me, the language did not bother me. I just put myself in each scene of the exercises, in the various gospel scenes, and I just was totally, totally free. And the language did not mean anything to me. So when I talk to women, young women, whether they're students or whether they're my colleagues in administration, and we talk about Ignatius and we talk about the language of the exercises or the language of the constitutions, I always tell them, look beyond that, realize that it was a, you know, 16th century man of his time writing that, but just look what you can gain if you just look beyond and you just imagine yourself. I think imagination is clearly the key word here. Isabel would probably say it hasn't gone far enough because she really wanted to be a Jesuit. But what does it mean to be a Jesuit? Can't you be a companion to the members of the Society of Jesus with not necessarily having SJ after your name? For me personally, that is a great gift that I've been given at Fordham through many individuals, lay and Jesuit. And I think Inez would be happy to see the community here and to see how the women, so many women, faculty and administrators and staff work hand in hand with the Jesuits in many, many areas. And I really think, all in all, they would be pretty pleased. I talked about imagination. Ignatius's vision shows us freedom of imagination and spirit. But I also hope that women will look at these women of the past, and that they won't become footnotes and anomalies. These names of these women should not be, hidden. They should be mentioned more. Their stories should be told more. And I don't know if it means, taking Rahner's letters, and I don't know how many copies of Rahner's compilation of letters are even available nowadays, but even just taking them, condensing them, putting them in a soft covered book with the faces of the women, I can see that happening. And just, keeping it at the Jesuit universities and colleges, and just letting people know that there is more of a history of the Society of Jesus and more of a history of Ignatius that is very inclusive of women and women's roles. And so that's really what I would like to see in the future.